Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be tuning in from. Welcome to, and I've got to go look for it. This is episode 42 of Industry Insights with Veeam. And you may notice that the other fellow doesn't look as much like Jason Buffington as normal, although bearded, so I get him confused. But I am Dave Russell, joined this week by senior technologist Michael Cade. Jason is actually off for vacation this week with a group of Boy Scouts, I believe. They're out camping. Michael joins us from England. Thank you so much for stepping in, Michael.
No worries, Dave. Pleased to be here. Awesome.
Yeah. Well, good to see you. We wanted to do something a little different. We want to do a little bit of a deep dive on containers. And you recently now have taken on a special assignment, a half-year, 6-month assignment over in Kasten, a group within Veeam that focuses on container management. And so we're going to do a bit of a double click on containers. And this is really meant for people that may not be hugely familiar with containers. So as a preamble, what I want to do is just a couple quick things, housekeeping wise. Give a shout out where you might be tuning in from in the comments there. I'm in Boulder, Colorado in the US. Michael's in England. We've got our producer in Georgia. We've got our production associate, Alina. She is in Romania. And love to hear where you're from. We'll come back to this a couple times, but just give us a quick shout out or give us any kind of questions that you may have. Now, Michael, right off the bat, I usually kind of close with a few things, but right off the bat, I want to just start with a bit of a tease. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about this, but this is a book, an ebook called 7 Critical Reasons for Kubernetes Native Backup. And I liked it because it wasn't just a vendor commercial. And we should be dropping in the both a blog site, a URL to a blog that talks about this, as well as the URL to download this ebook itself. But maybe just take us through a little bit about what people can expect from this.
Yeah, I think the first thing, and this is all new to me as well, right? And I think that's the important thing with this side hustle over that's happening over in Kasten. This has been a learning curve for me as well. So what was very refreshing when you start reading content like this is that, okay, it's come from customer research, but it's also focusing on the different deployment patterns. It's focusing on DevOps, which is sometimes seen as a bit of a scary word, but we'll probably get into it a little bit more, is that actually it's just bringing the application developers closer to the operation so that you're getting the best of both worlds. And that's very simply put, but it's not as scary as maybe it's been made out to be across the community, across the industry. Then it talks about Kubernetes from an operation challenges point of view. So how do you can't take all of the same methodologies that you maybe had in a virtualization world or on a physical world. You've got to actually adapt, and there's different ways to being able to achieve that. So this goes into some of those like key points, tips, if you like, that kind of touch on that as to, make sure that you consider this. Where do we put our data? How do we store it? And because the nature of Kubernetes is around scale and application scale at that. And that means dynamically applications grow, they shrink, they dynamically expand, all of that good stuff that we've been hearing and talking about in a virtual world, but now we're talking at much greater scale and much more flexibility to that. So then it talks about things like, well, why do you need to back up Kubernetes and why is it a thing? Because there's a camp that says Kubernetes should just be stateless, and there's a camp that obviously knows and sees where there is an absolute requirement for stateful workloads within Kubernetes as well, like your databases and things that have a persistent state within your environment. Databases has been probably the most common shift in over the last 18 months is really that. So it touches on some of them. It's not deep technical. It's very, very much vendor agnostic as well. Yes, okay, Kasten by Veeam got this information, collated this together and put it into this ebook. But really, it's not a vendor pitch. It is very much a focus on these are the challenges that you're going to potentially come across. And this is a way of thinking how to fix those.
Yeah, excellent. Good stuff. And, one of the things that has been interesting just as a sort of observer, someone that's a little bit removed from containers and from a day-to-day basis has been just now the need for stateful persistent data stores, meaning as containers become more production class, we're using them in anger, as folks say in your neck of the woods, now the need to manage that better, make it available, maybe have rich data services like disaster recovery or ability to migrate workloads. But just the fact that even though we hear stories of containers have a half-life of minutes or maybe even seconds, that may be true in some cases, but to your point, there are databases in particular where that data needs to persist and needs to persist for a long period of time.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that, like, let's say you've got a typical application, a front end and a back end, a web server and a database that holds all of that critical basket information, a shop checkout type thing. It's not about that. Them pods, they can be updated quite dynamically. Even if you're using Postgres SQL or using Cassandra or any NoSQL SQL based like database, it doesn't really change that they can be updated. The thing that's important is that persistent volume. That persistent volume and the claim to that never changes. That's the stateful bit, not the pod. And as soon as you start thinking about, like, so Kubernetes for me, I dived into it a bit over, like, and just know kind of the very top thin line of Kubernetes, but really the when you understand things like the deployments, the pods, so pods are your containers where your application lives. Then you've got your persistent volume claims. So that's how I'm going to say I need this amount of storage and I need it in this particular storage class. And then persistent volumes are the actual data, like the LUNs that we're aware of in our virtual worlds. So as soon as you've got as soon as you understand that at a high level what that means, that then plays into, you'll understand the infrastructure and the requirements are not that dissimilar to what we see in the virtual world.
Yeah, it's interesting. You always believe history repeats itself, or that best practices find a way of remaining best practices, even as infrastructure or abstraction layers may change. Told we've got an update on the map of maybe some dozen or so countries now. Let's take a quick peek in on that. Yeah, sure enough, we do. So in the US, we've got the addition of Kansas City, and we also have New Hampshire. And then looking around the globe, yeah, we're up to, looks like 13 countries. We've got Czech Republic, Istanbul, Kenya, Brazil, South Africa, India, Switzerland, Jamaica, Netherlands, Colombia, I see there as well. So good representation from many different geographies. Thank you very much for that. Michael, I was telling you just before we came on screen that been doing a couple of external events this morning, last few hours, and did a shout out in actually United Emirates for this in Dubai for this very LinkedIn live stream. So maybe that rolled over. Speaking of rolling over, you got to show us and tell us about your shirt, man. This, for those that can't see it, that is actually the Kasten logo. So that's a K and a 10. So take us through that. Take us through your swag a little bit.
Well, yeah, that's the only reason why I'm doing the special assignment is because of the swag. The swag looks a little bit different to the green stuff, and I've got plenty of green stuff, right? But yeah, so just obviously representing across the community and trying to learn as much as I am, trying to give back some of that education that I'm managing to get hold of.
Awesome. Let's go to our first content slide and just tease up a little bit about when you're deploying containers and you need to orchestrate them, some of the things you need to keep in mind. I see we have a question that came in. So as you walk us through this, Michael, I'll find a point to kind of interject with a end user question as well.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've found in this journey of learning from let's call it the virtualization world, where the majority of our listeners, watchers are going to be, they're going to be leveraging vSphere. They're potentially going to have a have a footprint in the public clouds, and they've probably heard of Kubernetes and containers, but they're probably not yet into that space. And I think where you just said history repeating itself, Dave, is I believe it's exactly true in that, but I think it's history repeating itself, but faster. Like when we went from physical to virtual, and now virtual to this cloud native approach, the biggest thing around Kubernetes, again, that I've seen is it doesn't matter where you decide to run Kubernetes, it's the same Kubernetes, if that makes sense. So it's the same distribution, it's the same code base. It kind of seems very similar to what we do with Veeam backend replication, where that same piece of software, regardless of size of business, where it can run anywhere. So you choose to run it on premises, on your own hardware, or you choose to run it in one of the bigger public clouds. There are managed service Kubernetes clusters available out there from all sorts of different service providers with varying different service, like additional services and features along that. And that list is only growing and getting longer and longer. But really, that opens up the door to many different things, especially if you think from an application point of view. So quick deployment and configuration, it really doesn't take long, especially the public cloud. It really doesn't take long to start getting a Kubernetes cluster or a managed Kubernetes cluster up and running in the likes of Amazon, where they have their EKS, in Google Cloud Platform with their GKE, Microsoft Azure have AKS, and there's and everything in between as well. So you could just go and run an Azure VM or 3 Azure VMs and build a 3-node cluster for your Kubernetes cluster and just get to grips with that. As well as even on your local machine, you could build out a various different distributions that allow you to at least have that same control and play with what that needs to look like. And that opens up the door to, well, we could develop something here on our laptop, and that same deployment can now go and live in a much scaled out approach in our live system that is maybe in AWS or in one of the public clouds. And that quick deployment just really enables everything to be closer. You're test and dev, and I know this from my admin days from a virtualization point of view. In theory, everything needs to be the same. Test and development needs to be the same as your production or your staging. 9 times out of 10, that falls out of sync and something changes because hardware needs to be taken from this one and pushed into the production and vice versa, and things happen, things change. That's not really the case from a Kubernetes point of view, in that because it's so hardware agnostic or cloud agnostic or whatever agnostic you need, where it can run pretty much on any hardware. I mean, it runs on Kubernetes itself, the distribution runs on Raspberry Pi as well. So you can even go that far and use a different architecture from a CPU perspective. But also what that means is that whole ethos around being able to maintain security, make it very fast when it comes to upgrading those pods, like just literally going from one version to another. And in this world, things are moving very quick in terms of being able to upgrade on a weekly basis, a 2-weekly type sprint, being able to deliver updates to your software, to your application. So you're never looking after this big monolithic application anymore, because that's broken down into small microservices. And then with that, it allows you to be very scalable on those in particular microservices. And then this is where probably the bit on the right hand side of the slide. So when it comes to stateless applications, things like your web servers, where there's not really anything in there that you need to keep a hold of, like there's no database, there's no we don't really care for it. Think about and you've probably heard this, the cattle versus pets. Pets are very much the servers that we look after. We feed them water on a daily basis, whereas cattle, yeah, we still have to feed them, but we really don't care which one's first, and we don't care where they sit, where they live in the field, if you like. And they can, 1 week they're here and 1 week they're gone. Now take that down to minutes. 1 minute they're here, 1 minute they're gone, because they can be dynamically deployed and destroyed as and when you need to update just the website in a different design. But then you get into more the stateful applications, and this is focusing on, well, I need this database container to remain the same for X amount of time, because this is where all of our catalog, it's where our basket, it's where our mission critical data lives. And it might be that you leverage everything from one of those stateless applications to be able to put it into that database. And this is where it's going to write to that storage. Think databases, for example. And this is where we need to consider that data protection point in terms of being able to protect that data.
Brilliant. Now, we have had a couple questions come in. I do want to just acknowledge that, because I think after an additional slide is when I want to hit you with these two questions. So let's call an audible here and skip over the next slide and go into the architecture slide. We'll come back to the Kasten K10 product slide, but you're kind of edging towards how this actually looks like at implementation, right? And so I thought maybe if you could take us through this at a high level, this would be a good setup to ask a couple of the viewer questions, and then we can drift back into the upfront version of what does this look like from a product perspective.
Yeah, so there's kind of three trains of thought when it comes to backing up Kubernetes. One is I don't need to, because I have a distributed architecture, the data, I'm not running any stateful workloads. That is the one play. And if you're not, and if you are just running stateless and you are just running web servers or anything that can spin up, spin down dynamically, then there might not be any reason for protecting that workload. But as we're seeing that growth around being able to push more stateful workloads into your Kubernetes cluster, that's obviously where we need to start thinking about how do we best protect those workloads. Now, there's various ways there would be a train of thought, well, why can't I use my existing Veeam backup replication? If we're using a persistent volume that lives on a NAS share, well, we could just grab that as part of our NAS backup and, well, we've got a copy of all the data. Well, that's true, you could, but where that gets very complicated is, well, how do we start recovering that? And how are we aware of that platform? And I'll go back in time to before we go into like the architecture of Kasten K10, is that think about when you became Veeam customers and you were maybe going from physical to virtual. And there were a lot of backup vendors out there at the time that they used agents on their physical, which we do today, Veeam does today. But then they also just ported those agents into the virtual environment, completely disregarding anything underneath, any of the virtualization stack, what is underneath. They just went, oh, we're just going to treat it as a physical machine. We don't care if it's virtual, which that's when Veeam came along and went, no, actually, the best way to achieve this is actually use the native virtualization APIs to be able to take a much more efficient and fast way of being able to take that backup. So going back to what I just said, the NAS backup, yeah, okay, you will have a copy of the data. It's not going to be QS'd. It's not going to be application consistent. It's not going to give you that functionality. And that's very much I'm going to bring my physical agent to the virtualization party. And we know how that has developed over the last 10, 13, 14 years. So what K10 brings is the ability to sit inside the Kubernetes cluster, leveraging Kubernetes APIs, so natively into the same platform where your workloads are living, basically a namespace that talks directly to the Kubernetes APIs to be able to deal with those policy-based, being able to back up your applications, your mission critical workloads, your stateful workloads, and give you not only a native snapshot as a point in time restore point, but then also being able to offload those off to object storage or other storage areas from an export point of view. And then all in all, where this really does tie in is, well, how do we keep it consistent? How do we make it application consistent so that if we need to recover either the whole namespace or the whole application, how do we do that? But then on top of that, how can we be granular as well? How do we bring back, I've mentioned around microservices it's kind of taken that monolith So think about your Microsoft SQL Server today in a virtual environment, potentially clustered as well. So multiple nodes within your cluster. All of the different services are within there. Now break all of them individual services out, and that's where you get a container for each one. They can be scaled accordingly so that you can take advantage of that. But then also from a backup point of view, we can choose, oh, I only need to bring back that one database or that container that looks after that particular service or that artifact. And I think that's the best way to kind of talk about how K10 approaches that data management protection within a Kubernetes environment.
Awesome. So, Priyanka, if you're still with us, I promise we're going to get to both of your questions shortly here. Let's hit the map. I think we've got a half a dozen additional countries since we last looked at it, and a few United States states that have added in. From the U.S. side, looks like we've got Oregon, New York, we've got Chicago, Illinois that's filled in. Globally, we look like we've got Denmark, Portugal, Sweden, Ukraine, Greece, another person from England. So there's a couple of you over there, Michael, in England that are up for containers on a Monday for sure. France, if I didn't mention that already. So thank you, everyone. Keep that coming. So now, time to stump Michael Cade, one of my favorite activities. We've got, Priyanka, I have two questions. First, Michael, is how can container workload protection backup running in remote sites like Kasten K10 by Veeam, can you describe sort of the steps involved in that? So again, if I repeat that, how can containers workload protection backup running in remote sites work with something like Kasten?
So I think I get the question in that, so Kasten, and maybe it was already discussed on that last slide with the K10 architecture, in that Kasten lives, or K10 lives within the same Kubernetes cluster. So if you've got multiple Kubernetes clusters, maybe you've got staging, maybe you've got development, maybe you've got test, as well as production, then you would have a K10 instance or a K10 deployment in each one of those clusters to look after them. But then what Kasten also has is the ability to do multi-cluster. So you, on one of those clusters, becomes your main, if you're your master, if you like, and you can see all of those other K10 clusters or K10 deployments that you have within the different clusters through one single interface. So hopefully that helps. So within there, you can create policies across the board. Like, let's say you've got a NoSQL database that lives in all of your staging areas, pre-prod, prod, etc. You could put a tag against those and say, I just want to back up, or I want to snapshot, and I want to do that on an hourly basis. But then I want to export all of the backups for NoSQL off to object storage on a daily basis, maybe an hourly basis as well. Well, instead of going to each individual one and doing it very methodically that way, and obviously time consuming, especially if you've got hundreds of clusters, then you've got the ability to use MultiCluster that will allow you to set a global policy that is just doing it once, and it will span across all of those K10 deployments. Hopefully that's right. If not, let me know any further information. I'll happily help.
Well, you did such a good job on that. I am going to take a stab at Priyanka's next question, and then you correct me. So it's a bit of a future-facing question. So I'll sort of mention this from a distance, meaning not a whole lot of specifics. But the question is, can you share how Kubernetes backup and Veeam could be functioning together, is essentially the question. And what I'll say, and then you jump in, Michael, is if you look at all of our cloud solutions within Veeam, meaning now we have Office 365 capabilities, including Teams. We have our Azure, AWS, now Google Cloud Platform, GCP capabilities, and Kasten as well. So that's 5 capabilities. Let me get in the screen there. They are designed to operate independently, meaning in this case, if you're a DevOps person, you might be happily running K10, the Kasten product, off to the side, and that's all that you need for your activity. Same if you happen to be the Office 365 administrator, that's all of your focus. However, you might also want to be able to manage that from the broader Veeam platform. And what we do is layer in capabilities, a data format, a management construct to be able to allow that. So where am I going with that? Well, today, Kasten K10 is sold separately as a unique solution. However, the similarities architecturally to Veeam, the parallels are kind of amazing. And so we see not too distant future where much like Veeam backup and replication can handle, manage, and move and understand that format of data from those other cloud products, that in the near future could be the case for Kasten as well.
Yeah, you nailed it, Dave. Yeah, exactly that.
Okay, all right.
So if there's
Good.
So if there's anyone out there using the external repository, so the external repository where you're using one of the Veeam backup for cloud workloads, the AWS, the Azure, the GCP, and you're sending your backups into an S3 repository or object storage, native object storage, that external repository can be seen by Veeam backup and replication if you so wish. It doesn't have to be, it just can. And then that's seen in that native file format and allows you to do some pretty cool recovery options with that. So we're actively looking at, well, how does that then look? Because we believe, obviously, that there's going to be a lot of customers out there, and you probably are already today if you're watching this webinar or you're at least thinking about it, then looking at Kubernetes, it's not going to take over your virtualization estate. It's probably going to sit side by side, very much like your cloud endeavors have gone as well. So you're going to have a bit of this, a bit of cloud-based workloads to back up. You're going to have a bit of on-prem still, whether that be physical, whether that be virtual. Obviously, we've got Veeam backup and replication for that, whether it's Kubernetes. And what we want to be able to do is give that way of being able to at least absorb that data into that same management plane in VBR. But also, it obviously needs to sit and work as its own standalone as well, because there will be a lot of customers that just need that to live with the developers or live with that DevOps team, the operations team that look after that. So yeah, but Dave, you nailed it.
Cool. So a couple questions did come in. In the interest of time, I'm going to pass over one because I think we're going to hit that organically in a moment here. The other is there Kubernetes backup configuration feature available in V11? Short answer is Veeam backup and replication version 11 is laying the groundwork for upcoming integrations. There aren't capabilities within Veeam backup and replication V11 today. That might be a good cue for the slide for our Kasten product called K10. A little bit of an overview on the K10 platform, Michael, before we wrap up.
Yeah, and I kind of touched on this with the architecture, but this kind of simplifies it, is that rather than looking for virtual machines or choosing virtual machines to protect, we're looking at the namespaces. We're looking for the applications that are being deployed. So then we're able to protect them, but also be able to protect them in an application consistent way, as well as discovering that. And then you create a policy based on those applications and what your requirements are. So anything new that you tag with a certain application, or whether it sits there with MongoDB, it will be dragged into that policy so that you don't need to go in and add those containers every time. Remember what we said at the start is those containers are constantly evolving and changing. So, and all whilst obviously from a Veeam point of view as well, that simple, easy to use, wizard driven approach is there for who needs that. But also remember what I said about the API as well, being able to leverage the native APIs from Kubernetes to be able to get down into your YAML files and be able to create those policies that way as well. So from an API perspective, it's all still there. And then end-to-end security, looking at how we protect that data, especially when that data is leaving your environment and going off to S3, and how we're going to encrypt that data and make it safe so it's not going to be compromised from that point of view as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. Let's hit the map one more time. I told we've got a country we haven't seen before in the LinkedIn live stream. The Democratic Republic of Congo is participating for, I believe, our first time. So thank you very, very much for that. Very cool. Now, Michael, as we wrap up, let's hit the slide around how people, if they're new to containers or just want to try Kasten, there are a couple of ways that you can get your hands on this and actually get experience.
Yeah, so there are. There's two ways, and when I dived into this a few weeks back, the first one doesn't require you to have any hardware. You don't have to install it anywhere. You don't have to pay any money for hardware costs up in the cloud. It's literally a hands-on lab that walks you through the steps of being able to protect your Kubernetes applications, your workloads. And if you hit that QR code that you see on the screen now, that will take you to that hands-on lab that walks you through with instructions. So if you've never seen Kubernetes before, and this is my biggest takeaway for the whole session, is don't feel overwhelmed by Kubernetes. Everyone's talking about it. No one's experts in it. Go and have a look at it. Familiarize yourself from a virtualization point of view into how the Kubernetes constructs work in that world. But this is going to give you an ideal way of being able to see and feel what that's like. And it's very much a hand-holding exercise that takes you through. Then we get to number 2, and this is for anyone that is on the stream that is already familiar, and maybe you've already played around and you've maybe deployed a Kubernetes cluster, but you're interested in what do you mean by data management in this space. So there's a lot of options on there. Obviously, I mentioned around that Kubernetes can be literally ran anywhere, pretty much. There's lots of options. So whether it's on premises in your lab, your home lab even, or whether it's up in Google Cloud, or whether it's leveraging OpenShift, whether it's leveraging Microsoft Azure AKS, or even just natively running Azure VMs and you've built your own cluster that way. That second option is where the commercial product sits. Now, the important thing, obviously the production product or commercial product is obviously what you pay for. The important thing that I'll note here is that there is a free edition, as always with Veeam. Whether it's called Community, I think it's just called K10 free edition at the moment. But what it will give you is 10 free nodes forever. And when you think about nodes in a Kubernetes world, you could think about your ESXi host or your Hyper-V hosts and probably times that by quite a bit, considering what happens under the hood. And that, to me, is a true way of being able to allow us as a community, us as an industry, to really get to grips with not only the Kubernetes landscape, but also from a backup point of view. We tend to always think about backup last, or it's very much always down the list, right, Dave?
Yeah.
And I think with this, by being able to enable people to understand what the backup means and data protection and recovery, then this is really going to allow you to learn and understand a little bit more about that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for taking the time to visit with us, go a little bit deeper on containers. As a look ahead, do want to do a repeat of the commercial, that ebook, 7 Critical Reasons for Kubernetes Native Backup. I think you'll see the URLs being dropped in again. And as we look ahead for the next couple of sessions, this Friday, we've got Rick Ksenia and Nicola discussing Veeam community. And those are going to be things like the Veeam Legends programs that recently announced, the Veeam Vanguards program that just completed its 2021 class, as well as other ways you can get involved with Veeam in our community. Then on Monday, Jason will be back. He and I are going to have another special guest. So we've got a few weeks in a row of special guests. We're going to have John Anand from the Infotech Research Group. An industry analyst John is. He's going to chat with us. We're going to talk about what he's seen in the world out at large as it relates to backup. And one final commercial, March 31st is World Backup Day, and Rick Vanover's got an event planned, a 1-hour event going on for that, a LinkedIn live activity. We've got some swags, we've got some Bose giveaways. You can see the little click link there, as well as the code. So encourage you to check out all the upcoming content. Want to thank Michael for joining. We had a couple questions that came in. Michael and I will make sure we get those answered. Thanks for tuning in. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next live stream. Bye for now.